Okay, hello and welcome everybody to the Erosion Management for Lake Erie workshop presented by New York Sea Grant, New York State Department of State, and the Army Corps of Engineers. I just want to get a quick confirmation that what you're seeing right now is a nice shoreline picture of Lake Erie and not a bunch of other stuff on the screen. If I can get some nods or Megan. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the thumbs up. We're slowly letting a few people, late arrivals come in. We are expecting about 60 people today, so that's fantastic. You guys can be part of the proud record holding workshop for me. This is the most I've ever had at one time, so that's really, really great. Just quickly wanted to do some housekeeping. We will be recording today's session. And that is so that people can watch this again after today, but also for the folks that couldn't make it today, that they'll be able to come back and watch it and learn about the Lake Erie shoreline and the permitting involved in the shoreline. So quick introduction. I'm Roy Woodrick. I'm the Great Lakes Coastal Processes and Hazards Specialist for New York Sea Grant. And with me today is Megan Coker. She is in our Buffalo office and she's going to be help monitor the chat. So we ask that you two please use the chat box rather than talking over the speakers or anything like that. We should be able to answer your questions pretty quickly, whether it's during the presentation or quickly after each presentation. We also have time set aside at the end to make sure that we can answer any questions that are not answered during the other sessions. So with that, I just want to remind people to be mindful and kind to others. Please don't speak over people, wait for your turns to talk when it comes to that. Everybody should get a chance to say what they want to. If you do have questions, put them in the chat box. And that should be that. So I'm going to stop my video so I don't distract myself. And do that. And we'll get started. So I quickly went over what we're expecting to do today. The agenda is kind of going to look like a New York City overview. I'm going to talk about living on the shoreline and the hazards of living on the Lake Erie shoreline, but also the mitigation options available to New York State residents to solve some of their erosion and shoreline flooding issues. So after that, New York State DEC is going to talk about the permitting and coastal erosion hazard areas on Lake Erie. Department of State is going to talk about the coastal consistency review, and we're going to hear from the Army Corps, United States Army Corps of Engineers on their regulatory program as well. And we will have a quick discussion afterwards, and hopefully we can answer a lot of questions you folks have today. Quickly, I wanted to talk about who this is that is bringing you this workshop today. We are an organization called New York Sea Grant. A lot of people, even on the shorelines, don't quite know that we exist. But we are a network of integrated research, education, and extension services promoting coastal economic and community vitality, environmental sustainability, and citizen awareness of the state's marine and Great Lakes resources. We are one of 34 similar programs in the United States. We are different from the rest of them. However, in that we do have two separate programs, one for the Great Lakes and one for our marine shorelines as well. So the Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean, Hudson River, and the estuary. We have specialists in hazard resilience in coastal communities, safe and sustainable seafood supply, sustainable coastal development, and healthy coastal ecosystems. And our Great Lakes offices are in Buffalo, Newark, Oswego, and Ithaca. I personally am in Oswego, but I serve the shorelines of Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence River, and the Niagara River as well. And I just want to say thank you to DEC and our ongoing partnership with them, because without them, we would not be having workshops like we are having today. So why are we here today? We are here today because we are all living among the shoreline, working among the shoreline, making rules and zoning codes and laws on the shoreline. Humans have always been around water. We can see that in the way that we have settled today. The Lake Erie shoreline is very heavily populated. And we even looking in the archaeological record, we can always find people like to settle by water. It is part of our nature to be near water. However, there are hazards associated with these environments, and that could be flooding, that could be erosion, that could just be debris that comes up on your shoreline. There's a lot of parts that, as much as beautiful and wonderful as living on the shoreline are, there are some pesky parts of it that we want to help you folks deal with as well, and do so in a lawful and environmentally responsible way. So I work on a variety of different shorelines in New York State. One of the most unique is absolutely Lake Erie. The Lake Erie shoreline is mostly composed of this mix of sedimentary rock cliffs, and that's usually shales and marine rocks interbedded. You can see in the background of this image, this flaky stuff is the shale, and the harder, thickly bedded stuff is your more sandy, silty kind of older sediments. That's great. If you want to live on top of that, it's good. It's usually generally erosion resistant. However, on top of it is a whole bunch of glacial material. The glacial material has not been around for so long. It is mostly deposited by a previous stage of Lake Erie, which we call glacial Lake Warren. So we see a lot of sands and clays and gravels that are dumped on the shoreline, which sit on top of this bedrock, but are also very easily erodible on top of it. So you can imagine the waves come in, they hit the bedrock, they generally tend to smash into these softer sediments, and they can erode pretty quickly. But we also see, especially in years of higher lake levels and intense winds like we've seen since the end of 2019 especially, these shorelines are also prone to a buildup of a lot of woody debris. I've seen staircases, telephones, electrical outlets, strings, wires, rebar, pretty much everything you can imagine on the Lake Erie shore. So that's something we want to avoid as well. And of course, we also have to deal with seiche on Lake Erie. And the seiche is it doesn't only happen on Lake Erie, but we see some of the most, just replaying this over again so you guys get a second look. Lake Erie is prone to these seiche events, which is very long, prolonged winds along the lakeward, long axis of the lake. So starting towards Toledo and up towards Buffalo. And what happens in these, we have intense wind for at least 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours. And all this water just kind of ends up on the east side of Lake Erie. And it's, tends to result in a lot of lakeshore and tributary flooding, but also in a lot of severe erosion. We've seen this quite a bit as of late. And for those of you that were in the Buffalo and south of Buffalo area, just a few nights ago, you saw a pretty reasonable seiche. So it just happened to make national news during Monday Night Football. We saw the wind at the stadium, but that was also, potentially causing a lot of damage to the shoreline environments as well. So I just wanted to put a quick plug in for a publication that is coming out. If it's not totally public now, it'll be coming out this week or next week. We did do a quick write-up on seiche, why they happen, how they have happened in the past, and what we can look at in the future, but also ways to plan for these events to make your properties a little bit more resilient. And that includes winterizing your properties with lifting docks out, lifts, boat houses, and so on. And we just want to make sure that there's one thing that you plan for when planning for the future of your own shoreline. So if you want a copy of that, you can contact me directly. We will be printing some out, but it's all digital at this point. So what does this look like when we see these seiche events? Well, we tend to see a lot of shoreline damage, especially in times of high lake levels. This is one of the first reports I got at the end of 2020, I believe. I think I got this one in November of last year. This is down towards the Irving area. I believe. And you could see that this seiche came up and just tore the shoreline apart. It threw a lot of these large slabs of shale and sandstone up onto the shoreline, which could potentially be a safety factor, but it also just totally undermined this deck and it ended up falling over the edge. So we see a lot of issues like that. We see these just severing of these roots, which kind of leads to the instability of these trees and the shoreline environments as well. We also see just intense debris washing up from these. I mean, when you get these long duration events, you have 8 hours worth of just wood. We see all sorts of different stuff in here. There's some drainage tile in the background. There's a telephone pole. There's firewood or potentially creosote logs, hard to tell. Some sort of woodworking type wood. It looks like some other stuff with points to it. And then a whole rack of sand fencing as well. So we see a lot of debris associated with these as well. For those of you that have shoreline structures built in already, we also often see damage to those. Especially what I noticed in some of my site visits this summer was that these seiche waves would come up, or the winds blew waves up onto the shores during these seiche events that overtopped the walls and actually put a lot of water behind these walls. And that water could not drain back into the lake and builds up pressure behind these walls when not adequately drained, causes some erosion there. And in other instances, complete failure of some of these walls as well. So we can see that, this wall has stood for however many decades. These seiches come in, they flood the area behind the walls and build up this pressure. The wall collapses, and then you get this very quick process of erosion directly afterwards. We also see intense destruction to some of the shoreline buildings. This is a boathouse, I believe, in the Hamburg area, where we see total whole wall came down. I'm not even sure if this electrical implement attached to what might be a staircase or part of a building or a roof piece. We see, just wires hanging out of this thing. There's all sorts of iron cables, rebar, and these tend to be pretty messy. We want to make sure that when you guys are thinking about planning for your property, that you're taking into account that these events could be very potentially damaging to shoreline structures, but also that we can plan for them. This is kind of like the third image there, just a more intense case. Picked this one because it's just straight grass up to the edge of a wall. There was no drainage installed here, so it kind of just built up behind and eroded out from behind. There's a lot of ways that we can make this a lot more suitable to the environment and make it more resilient to these events. So how are we going to address shoreline erosion locally on the Lake Erie shoreline? Well, one point I want to get across is that there is no one size fits all technique for shoreline protection. Every parcel is unique. In a lot of cases, there's a wide range of options available, from hard to soft. So that's, concrete to grassed waterways. It could fall anywheres in there. But there's also, we don't want to completely separate that green or gray from hard or from soft or green. But we also want to help you consider hybridizing some of these methods with, the hard protection, but also with some of the nature-based features as well. And those hard options include revetments such as rock riprap, poured concrete seawalls, sheet piling, and those softer options can include just improving the drainage on your property. I saw that a lot this summer, where a lot of issues could be solved just by improving drainage in certain areas, getting that surface water off the surface and making sure it's not creating issues on the bluff face, and strategic use of vegetation as well. So I just wanted to go over a quick array of shoreline protection options available in New York State. What we see here is actually a really old rock riprap shoreline. And I chose this one because it shows that it doesn't just have to be this hard, bold black line on the shoreline where we pile up a whole bunch of rocks. But in time, this can actually be hybridized with the natural environment. Just ignore that Japanese knotweed in the bottom right-hand corner. We don't want to see that But you can see how using the spaces in between these rocks, we can actually work in vegetation and further stabilize, there we go, stabilize these shoreline features. Going much harder here, this is a poured concrete seawall up in, this is actually in northwestern Lake Ontario. But I like to use this picture because it shows a lot of what is happening when we put these vertical faces into the water. So we notice in the background where it's running up against this nice sand beach that the waves are breaking out farther away and kind of reaching the beach and spreading out. But when it's coming up, running up the shore and hitting this vertical concrete wall, a lot of it is splashing right up vertically, but even more is actually working downward. And in extreme cases, we can actually see that it's actually traveling towards me, holding the camera here. In extreme cases, we can see that these waves are coming in, they're hitting these walls, and they're scouring down underneath where the concrete was originally poured. And that can potentially lead to some instability in some of these features as well. What I do like to see in this photo, though, is that there are drainages built into this. That means that these waves that are splashing up and over into the lawn and what's running off the land here is actually draining out into the lake as freely without building up that extra pressure behind the wall and potentially further destabilizing it from the land side. Here we see a steel sheet pile and concrete sidewalk, which was actually, this is installed in a state boat launch facility in Oswego County. This is generally the worst case scenario, is to put something like this in because it is extremely permanent. It is a complete shutoff of the local ecosystem and the coastal processes that make the lakes what we love. This is a case where you absolutely have to stabilize the shoreline because this is a safe harbor. So this has to be used for police vehicles, police boats, fire boats potentially. So that's one of the spots where we want to be completely sure that that shoreline is not changing in any way. I did mention a little bit about this transition between the gray and green type shoreline erosion methods. I'm going to be completely honest, on Lake Erie, a lot of these are going to be quite difficult because we are working with the shale cliffs. It is very hard to put a rain garden on top of a shale cliff. I'll be honest with you about that. And some of these aren't entirely applicable to New York, like some of these offshore breakwaters are not, necessarily what we would do for small scale private property type locations. But there are ways to build a lot of these softer techniques into your upper landscape, the areas that are sitting on top of those glacial sediments, less so the shale cliff areas. And we're always available to help you think through these things. So if you want to take that greener approach, just feel free to reach out and we'll help you out with that. You might be wondering why it matters, why we care about this, these shoreline ecosystems and the amount of sediments that's actually moving along the shoreline. Every parcel that is represented by the attendees today is part of a larger system. And these systems contribute to what we call our coastal processes. It's right in my job title, so this is right up my alley. It's what I think about all day long. These coastal processes are the buildup and the breakdown of the shorelines, the movement of the sediments that sustain these coastal landforms. So the beaches that we use to recreate on the lakes, the offshore sediment bars that are potentially habitat sources, spawning locations for fish, but also, this is the Great Lakes. These are migratory pathways, so a little bit of natural system for birds and turtles, amphibians. This is really important stuff. And if we want to keep and maintain the beaches in front of our properties, we really do need to be conscious about how we are managing the properties. What you see on the right is the Army Corps sediment budget for Lake Erie. Very interesting to take a look at. You see where a lot of the sediment is coming from on the shoreline, mostly from the tributaries, but you see how much is actually lost out to the lake in certain situations. And you can set it to increase shoreline protection. That'll tell you if we keep going at the rate at which we are, the potential ecosystem and coastal process resources that we might be losing in the future. So in thinking about Lake Erie specifically, we're often dealing with these cliffs and bedrock, which limits a lot of our options for shoreline management, but it's also a bit of an opportunity as well. I've been out to a few Lake Erie shorelines where I've seen, arrays of really hard vertical concrete like this. And at first glance, it's like, okay, let's hope that those waves aren't coming in and scouring underneath these walls. So we dig down a little bit and look. Even back in the 1960s and 1970s, some of these contractors had the bright idea to actually tie these structures into the bedrock and further stabilize these, which was great foresight. And that's something we really look forward to in a lot of future projects as well, that these will have that long-term time frame. But one discouraging thing I have seen is that we are still kind of treating the shoreline with this piecemeal approach that leaves a lot of neighboring properties either vulnerable to more erosion or, excuse me, or are just not as future looking as we would want. So again, these vertical walls are steepening near shore, so they are kind of messing with the natural sediment system. So we're really looking to lessen the steepness of the shoreline in most cases and make these more functionable landscapes. And one way we can do that is through community approaches as well. So this community approach, rather than treating every parcel for itself, it's organized. It gets people talking. It gets a combination of resources working. So when you're working with your neighbors, you can kind of maybe in the end you can produce something that is much more sustainable and much more risk resilient in the future. And in doing so, it's less combative with the neighboring shorelines. So if you look in the upper right of this image right here, it's the guy in the middle, he puts in a wall. Immediately that starts to erode the neighboring shorelines because they are unprotected. This is probably a way too oversized wall anyways. It's just a cartoon, so we're not worried about it. But when you work together as this community, we build this bigger, more substantial, but also more resilient across a greater geographic reach than we would just considering every 50-foot piece of shoreline by itself. So we really do want to look at like the community aspect of this. So there are non-structural options as well in long-term planning that we just wanted to mention quickly. This is more of reduction of risk to structures without changing the shoreline environment in any way. One way to do that would be elevation. So this is more for the flood-prone areas. This is another example from Oswego County, where there's actually a whole line of cottages in front of this. But in 2017, 2019, when they were dealing with a lot of flooding up there, they decided we don't ever want to have to deal with that. So let's lift this structure. Let's get in there with jacks and blocks and make this thing as resilient as possible. That lake could rise 10 feet and these folks would be all right at this point. So this is an extreme example, but I just happened to drive by one day and love the image of it. For the municipal folks on here, you can make your communities more resilient by adding setbacks and zoning requirements, distance to shoreline into your building permits and so on. I believe Beth and Dave, who are coming up next, are going to talk about coastal erosion hazard areas and areas that you just can't build in anymore. So please pay close attention to that. And there's also, multi-decadal, long-term planning, such as relocation or planned retreat, just, kind of getting farther away from the shoreline because we have simply just built too close to the shoreline and we are paying for it now. So in getting started, this is one of the questions I get most often when I talk with shoreline residents. It's like, where do I even start? Well, the first thing I want you to think of is to just thoroughly evaluate your situation, where you are located, the way the waves strike your property, how they strike your neighbor's property, what kind of shoreline erosion methods your neighbors have, and start to work with your neighbors. Do not avoid this conversation with them. You'll be happy in the end that you talk to them early on and get this conversation started. and get started early. We can't just keep waiting for these extreme events to happen, but we know that we're going to see more wind events. We know we're going to see stronger wind events, and we know we're going to have less shoreline ice in the winter. That's not going to protect the shorelines as well as it has in the past. Once you get moving the process, make sure that you are following those DEC, DOS, and Army Corps permitting processes. We've got a whole lot of that planned for later in today's session, so pay close attention to those. And don't be afraid to ask for help from New York Sea Grant, from New York State DEC. We are here to help you guys make the best decisions that you can for your properties. One thing I do want to say, please do not get experimental, because that's where things go pretty wild on these shorelines. I've seen some truly horrific ideas implemented on the lake, and that usually comes before the permitting agencies come in and say, you need to take that out because it's ridiculous. It's not going to work. In many cases, it is actually detrimental to the shoreline. I saw one case where a contractor came in and rebuilt a wall and put the riprap in vertically instead of horizontally, which just accelerated the erosion in certain places. So just want to make sure you talk to the experts before you start doing anything. We do have a few additional resources that are available on our, well, I guess our or my webpage, and that's nycgrant.org/GL Coastal. Chances are you went there to register for today's workshop. The first I want to mention is the erosion management for Great Lakes, New York's Great Lakes shorelines. This is pretty much a 26-page version with a lot of full color photos of today's presentations. These are the things you can do. These are the things that have been done and the considerations for the building of those, their influences on coastal processes and shoreline ecology. There's also a newer guide called Working with Nature. This is a native plant guide for New York's Great Lakes shorelines. It involves 44 or 48 different native plants that can be used in nature-based shorelines in New York State. So they're all native, they all grow on the shoreline. I made sure to check that I've seen them on the shoreline. So that's a good one for those of you that want to explore the more nature-based options as well. We also have the virtual site visits, which some of you have actually already used since you signed up. So that's been great to see. If you do the virtual site visit, it gives you a chance to tell about the history of your parcel and the specific issues that you're having. And you're also able to upload some photos of that as well. And that gives me I'm the only one that sees these, by the way. It gives me kind of an idea of how you are situated on the lake and what issues we can do. And from there, we just have a conversation about your shoreline management options. And in many cases, I actually come out and do physical site visits, evaluate the property, look it over and connect you with local permitting officials to try to get you moving in the right direction to solve some of these shoreline erosion issues. And with that, that is it for me. I am now going to hand it off to Dave Dink and Beth Geldart with New York State DEC, and they're going to talk about the DEC permitting processes. I don't see any questions in the chat. If we want to save, if you do have questions for me, feel free to bring them up at the end. But other than that, I'm just going to introduce our next speakers, and we're going to start talking with the DEC once I find my biographies. Here they are. So our next two speakers will be Dave Dink and Elizabeth Geldart. Dave Dink is the Regional Permit Administrator for New York State DEC's Region 9 Division of Environmental Permits. Dave manages a diverse array of permitting programs for 6 counties in Western New York, including the freshwater wetlands, protection of waters, and coastal erosion hazard area permits. He works out of the Region 9 office in Buffalo. Dave has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and a master's degree in environmental science from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Following Dave will be Elizabeth Geldart. Beth is the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area, or CEHA program co-coordinator for the New York State DEC Division of Water and works in the Western Flood Protection and Dam Safety Hub in the Avon office. She has served as the technical lead for New York State DEC's Western Flood Hub CHOP program since the inception of the hub over 7 years ago. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering from the State University of New York, Buffalo, and Beth is a licensed New York State professional engineer. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Dave, and we will get started with Lake Erie permitting.
Very good. Hey, thanks, Roy. Great presentation. Thanks to Roy and Sea Grant for putting the workshop together. And good afternoon to everybody out there. Can you folks hear me okay? Good, thank you. So like Roy said, my name's Dave Dink. I'm with DEC's Division of Environmental Permits in Buffalo. And my staff and I manage the permit programs for work along Lake Erie and Chautauqua and Erie counties. Next slide. Whoops, I'll go back one, please. Thank you. So I'll be describing these 3 ways here of getting a permit for shoreline protection or other shoreline type projects from DEC. So the options that are available are a general permit, an individual permit, and an emergency authorization. The general permit is available for a variety of situations, and I'll go through those in a little bit. This is the simplest way to get a permit from DEC, and simple is better in the permit world. An emergency permit is available for situations where there's an immediate threat to life or property, such as somebody's house or boathouse about to fall into the lake. We've issued a lot of these after the Halloween windstorm a few years ago, and definitely have seen quite a few up on Lake Ontario as well. The individual permit is our normal standard process for permitting everything else. And like I said, we'll get into those things too. Next slide. So the general permit is the quickest and easiest way of getting an authorization to do shoreline work. Oops, there we go. And in terms of the amount of time required, this is definitely the way to go. But it only works for a certain number of activities, a certain set of activities. I think there's 10 categories that the general permit covers. So the added benefit of doing your project under the general permit is that our colleagues over at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and New York State Department of State have already signed off on the general permit. And all these activities are covered. If you get a general permit from DEC, this general permit from DEC, you don't need to go see the Corps. You don't need to go see DOS. So it simplifies your life. So what sort of activities can be approved through the general permit? Quite a few. There's, I think, 10 activities that are covered. I think there's 4 on this slide. So repair and in-kind replacement of existing functional erosion protection structures. The repair or replacement of these structures must not extend waterward of the pre-existing footprint. Next is the new sloped rock revetments of less than 100 feet in length, necessary for the protection of existing and functional dwellings. Slope and height limits apply. Note that there has to be something on the property to protect. Third is the repair or reconstruction of existing public roads, bridges, utilities, and other public infrastructure. So this category would be most helpful for municipalities and agencies with some sort of an infrastructure along the lake. Last one on this page is the emergency repair of functional concrete or steel vertical break walls along the bluffs. And by installation of sheet steel piling immediately adjacent to the lakeward vertical face. So basically a new face on an existing vertical structure. Next slide. Next category, minor grading of scarped bluffs to create a stable slope. The project must include an approved vegetation plan to help the newly graded area to become stabilized. The use of toe stone can be allowed in some cases. The repair and reconstruction of docks, catwalks, and floats that were functional on April 1st, 2017. Not a lot of docks in Lake Erie. The stabilization of existing functional storm damaged dwellings, decks, and walkways through the use of bracing and pilings. The repair or reconstruction of walkways and stairways necessary for water access. The removal of channel blockages on Lake Erie tributaries with upland disposal of removed materials. Sorry that says Lake Ontario. And removal of debris by the use of motorized equipment. So that might be beach cleaning, removal of some of the debris. Those are pretty dramatic photos that Roy had with all sorts of debris on the beach. So if your project fits one of these categories, you're in luck and you can get a general permit. Next slide. So how do we get one of these things? So you would send in by email or regular mail to your regional DEC office a completed general permit application form. Current photos are extremely helpful. Photos taken before the damage occurred are also very helpful. And last, project plans. Both a site plan and a cross section are helpful. Beth will go next, but Beth has some great examples of project plans in her presentation. So we'll take a peek at that in a few minutes. Like I mentioned before, if your project meets the general permit criteria, there won't be any need to send that application to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or New York State Department of State. Next slide. So this is a miniature version of the the application form for the the general permit. I keep saying joint application, that'll come next. So this is the general permit application form. I apologize for the tiny little form, but it's basically a one-pager on the front and the back. Pretty simple to fill out. It asks for your contact information, location of the project, an application contact person if you have somebody doing some application, applying for that for you, the contractor's information if you have a contractor, a description of the project, and permission to visit the property. Like I mentioned just a minute ago, the application should be accompanied by photos and project plans. And Beth will show a couple of examples of plans in a minute. Often the contractor that you choose might help you prepare plans as part of the proposal, for the property owner. Next slide, please. So if the project doesn't meet the general permit, what do we do? An individual permit in that case would be required. So individual permit might be needed where a new shoreline protection structure is desired and that new structure is greater than 100 feet in length. Building an addition or a new structure in the coastal erosion hazard area, or maybe it's work near regulated wetlands. So the process is similar to that of the general permit, although we would use a joint application form, joint application for permit, and the forms and other materials will go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Department of State. The application process can be done all online and through electronic submission of documents. Ever since the pandemic, we've gotten virtually electronic for almost all our submittals come through email. We still do handle paper, but a lot more electronic than we were 2 years ago. If you go to the DEC website and you use the search box that's up on the top corner of the website there, you can look for all these forms. If you type in coastal erosion application checklist, you go to a page with all the links you need to complete the application process. I was just looking at that a second ago, making sure that what I said was accurate. So what do we need here? We need the joint application form, a short environmental assessment form, some current photos, maybe some historic photos if you got them, and then a project plan. And that application would then go to the DEC, DOS, and the Corps of Engineers. Next slide. So the last type of authorization I'll talk about is the emergency authorization. This is when there's problems out there, right? You got some serious problems. Call DEC. Hey, what's going on? You know, my house is going to fall in. My breakwater is going to collapse. My boathouse is going in the lake. You know, we can respond very quickly to a situation like that and try to avoid a lengthy application process and give you an authorization quickly. So it has to be an immediate threat to life, property, natural resources, health, and so on. And the DEC, we can only authorize under an emergency authorization the minimum amount of work necessary to overcome that emergency. So basically what you would do, and it would be a 30-day approval. What we would need, and it can be initiated by a phone call. That's probably the best way to get the ball going. And we need to respond very quickly back to you. So that's why it's important to contact us directly. We don't have a standard application form, but we would need contact information, an explanation of what the emergency is, a plan or a description of what work is being proposed. And if, you know, like I said, if a structure is in danger of collapse, give us a call and we'll help you through the process. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about the different types of authorizations. This Article 15, Protection of Waters, is a category of the environmental conservation law that is a specific law and then specific regulations that go along with this type of permit category. So for work in Lake Erie, you know, Niagara River, below the mean high water level, a protection of waters permit would be required. This would be authorized by one of the three ways that I've already talked about. And the DEC can only issue a protection of waters permit when the proposal is reasonable and necessary. The proposal will not endanger the health, safety, welfare of the people of the state of New York. And the proposal will not cause an unreasonable, uncontrolled, or unnecessary damage to the natural resources of the state. So a lot of the permits that we issue for folks along the Lake Erie shore are really more coastal erosion hazard area permits. A lot of the things that people are doing are not actually below mean high water. But I wanted to make sure that I talked a little bit about, you know, the law and the regulations behind what we're issuing under the general permit. Like any of the permit programs, we're trying to minimize environmental impacts, in this case to the lake or to the river. And we try to, you know, talk to people about what their project might be. Generally, new vertical walls might be discouraged. We would encourage green vegetative methods of shoreline protection when it's appropriate. And, you know, Roy talked a little bit about that. When are gray things, when are lots of rocks appropriate, when are vegetative methods appropriate. And we would try to discourage shoreline hardening to some extent, but allow it when it's necessary. Next slide. So these are two other areas of the conservation law that might apply. It's a little more rare on Lake Erie. Article 24 of the conservation law is the Freshwater Wetlands Act. And the Wetlands Act and its regulations are in place to protect certain wetlands in New York State. Article 11 and Part 182 there is the Endangered and Threatened Species Law. So these are regs that are in New York State to protect threatened and endangered species of fish and wildlife and their habitat. Again, on Lake Erie, these regulations typically do not come into play. But we would work with folks to try that might be proposing a project that might be near a wetland or a habitat of a bald eagle, maybe a bald eagle nest might be nearby. So we would encourage folks to avoid and minimize impacts from their project, evaluate alternatives that we can, you know, talk about and pick the practicable alternative. demonstrate that your project, this is the only practicable alternative, least damaging alternative that might meet your objectives. And once all those things are done, if necessary, they might be mitigation to avoid or to unavoidable impacts. Like I said, for most of the projects on Lake Erie, these regs would not come into play. It's really the protection of waters and the coastal erosion hazard area regulations. So, next slide. That's it for me. And for the next group of slides, I'll hand it over to Beth Geldart, our coastal erosion engineer. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. So again, my name is Beth Geldart, and I manage the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area Program for Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So I'm going to go through the coastal erosion management regulations and permit requirements specific to the coastal regs. So a little bit of background. In 1981, Article 34 of the Environmental Conservation Law became effective, and it essentially empowers DEC to identify, map, and develop regulations for certain activities and development within designated coastal erosion hazard areas. Article 34 is implemented by DEC under Part 505 Coastal Erosion Management Regulations, which is essentially it's a permit program for regulated activities within our mapped coastal erosion hazard areas. So most activities that would fall within this area requires DEC permits. Common activities that require permits include excavating, filling, dredging, the construction or modification of any type of structure or erosion protection structure, and as well as removal of vegetation. So like clear cutting, anything like that, those would all require permits. The purpose and intent of these regulations is really to protect and preserve the coastline's natural protective features. And we define natural protective features as our nearshore areas, beaches, dunes, and bluffs. The other intent of the program is really to limit the amount of development on these natural coastal features. Limiting development, it preserves the features, but it also ensures that our new development is not prematurely damaged or destroyed due to active erosion and the impacts of coastal storms. So before conducting a regulated activity within an identified coastal erosion hazard area, you must first obtain a coastal permit from DEC. And DEC can only issue a permit provided that it meets our permit issuance standards. So before developing plans, we strongly encourage residents to contact DEC because some activities may be restricted or prohibited depending on the location in order to protect the natural shoreline features. So our permit issuance standards for all shoreline activities are that it must be reasonable and necessary, and all reasonable alternatives to the proposed activity must have been considered. For a new erosion protection structure, for an example, we would want to know why the structure is required at the site and what alternatives you've evaluated. Alternatives that should be evaluated prior to considering a new hard erosion protection structure, like a breakwall or rock revetment, would be, no action. So, what would occur if you did nothing? Non-structural solutions, such as moving at-risk structures further landward, or possibly elevating existing upland structures. And then, of course, nature-based alternatives, such as restoring existing dunes, regrading bluff slopes, and planting vegetation. And then in addition to that, the proposed activity must not likely cause an increase in erosion to the adjacent areas and prevent or minimize adverse effects to natural protective features, existing shoreline structures, and natural resources. So as Roy mentioned earlier, some of these structures will cause adverse impacts to the adjacent areas. So we're looking to, minimize impacts to the greatest extent possible with any of these projects. Next slide. Okay, so these are examples of what our coastal erosion hazard area maps look like. And basically the exact location of the coastal erosion hazard area is determined based on these maps. The coastal erosion hazard area is made up of two jurisdictions. we have a regulated natural protective feature area and a regulated structural hazard area. So getting into the natural protective feature areas first, which are your beaches, dunes, bluffs. And those areas are delineated on our coastal erosion hazard area maps by that dark solid line that runs along the shoreline. And this area is regulated from the landward limit of that dark solid line to a point where mean low water depth is 15 feet. So within this area, the natural protective feature area, new non-water dependent structures such as like houses, garages, decks, sheds, all of that would be prohibited within this area. We do realize there are structures that exist there now, but as far as like new structures like that, those would not be allowed within this area. Activities that may be permitted include water dependent activities, and those are, shoreline access structures, erosion protection structures, and things like new docks. And they're not very common on Lake Erie, but there's quite a few on Lake Ontario. So the other jurisdiction is our structural hazard area jurisdiction, and that's delineated on the maps with a dark dashed line. And they're only mapped in areas where long-term average erosion rates are at least 1 foot or greater per year. This area is regulated from the landward limit of the dashed line to the landward limit of the solid line on the map. So essentially the area in between those two lines. New development within this area may be permitted, provided that it's a movable structure, which is a structure elevated on piles or piers, and placed at least 25 feet landward from the natural protective feature area line. The map on the right side illustrates where a new movable structure may be permitted. And then all of these maps can be downloaded at the link on the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a map that shows you where all of the coastal erosion hazard areas are mapped on the Great Lakes. So that's the red line on the map. And on Lake Erie specifically, the coastal erosion hazard areas extend from the town of Hamburg up in Erie County, and then all the way down to the town of Ripley in Chautauqua County, right near the Pennsylvania state border. The coastal regulations do give each community the ability to adopt and enforce their own local coastal erosion hazard area law. And so that would mean that the community would essentially regulate and issue their own coastal permits instead of the DEC. Communities on Lake Erie that are locally administered and issue their own permits include the town of Dunkirk and the town of Sheridan. So if you're located within one of those two towns, you would essentially need to work with your town to obtain the coastal erosion hazard area permit. Please keep in mind that even though a coastal permit would be obtained from those two towns, you could still need other DEC permits. If you're working in the water or if you're in a wetland by chance, you would still need to get a permit from DEC. Next. Okay, so now I'm going to go through a list of items that you would need to supply to DEC when applying for a coastal erosion hazard area permit. So the first thing we look for in an application is project justification, and if the activity meets our permit issuance standards. So really describing the erosion rates, a location of at-risk structures. Both of those things are very helpful for our review to get a really good idea of why you're proposing this activity. We'd also need to know that all alternatives to the activity were evaluated and considered. So erosion protection structures, as mentioned, they often cause adverse impacts to coastal processes. So the use of those should really be kind of a last resort when no other options are achievable. So, no action should be considered moving at-risk structures landward, and our nature-based alternatives such as planting vegetation, rebuilding dunes, or putting in tow protection and planting behind that. And there's also hybrid approaches, but really minimizing the amount of structural approach you're using in any activity is what we're looking for. You also need to we look to basically ensure that the project won't cause a measurable increase in erosion to adjacent areas. With that is basically limiting lakeward encroachment of new structures to the extent possible. And then also making sure that these structures are tied in properly to adjacent shoreline areas. So like with rock revetments, making sure they're rounded off at the end sections. If you have a new boat ramp, minimizing encroachment so that it doesn't extend further than your seawall, things of that nature. So other things we look for is, an aerial map, so we know where the project is located, and a stamped inside survey so that it's clear where the property boundaries are, especially if there's property boundary disputes, we really need to see that survey. And then also recent photos of the project site and adjacent areas where the project will tie into. Especially now with the quantity of applications coming in, we can't always get to every single site before reviewing an application. So photos are extremely helpful. Next slide. Okay, so additional information that needs to be included is the set of project plans. And that includes your cross-section plan and site plan. These plans really need to clearly show what the existing conditions are in comparison to the proposed work. And I'll go over a sample plan with you shortly, so you can see the level of detail we require. The plan details are usually what creates the most back and forth with an applicant, because oftentimes we really don't get enough information upfront in the initial plan set. So really, trying your best upfront to get as much detail as you can on those plans is very helpful. We also need a really good description of the construction methods. So, your manner of placement, what types of materials you're using, and, how you're accessing the project. So if you're, accessing the site from your property, or if it's from an adjacent neighbor's property, we would need to know that there was consent from that neighbor, basically allowing you to access to your shoreline area. We'll also need quantity of materials used above and below the mean high water level. The disposal location for any materials need to be removed. And then lastly, a long-term maintenance plan. So the maintenance plan is basically a plan that describes how often the structure will be inspected, what you'll be inspecting for, and how any repairs will be made to basically ensure that the structure will have a reasonable probability of lasting 30 years. And next slide, please. Okay. So this is a sample site plan, and it's for a rock revetment, but it gives a good example of the general details that we require for any shoreline project. So we essentially need to know where all the proposed structures are in comparison to your proposed work. So we need to know where the property boundaries are, where your existing house is, an existing garage or shed, existing adjacent shoreline structures. So, does your neighbor to the east have a rock revetment already? If they do, show that on the plans. If the, on the other side, if they don't have any shore protection structures, make sure that's indicated on the plan, because we would look for, how the structure is going to tie in at that section to minimize adverse impacts on the adjacent property. And then, the top of bluff and any temporary access roads. And then, of course, the measurements for your proposed structure, so length and width measurements. And then just, looking at it to make sure that, we're not at every site. So if there's any specific, things going on at the site that we should be aware of, just make sure that you're indicating those on the plans. Next slide. There we go. Okay, so this is an example of a cross section and the level of detail we require. And again, this is for a rock revetment, and that's because these are the most common types of projects. So that's what our sample plans are for. So if the proposed project changes along the shoreline, we would need a cross section for each area that's different. So, you know, if you have a new wall, let's say one section has a ramp repair, we would need a cross section for the new wall as well as the ramp. And again, this is for a sample plan or for rock revetment, but you know, for rock revetment, we would need to know like the rock size, the slope, height and width dimensions as it compares to the existing slope, the location of any regrading or planting, drainage layer details, and how the toe stone will be anchored into the lake bed. So will it be pinned? Will it be embedded into the lake? And we also need to know where the location of the mean high water level is as it relates to the project. So as Dave, you know, was mentioning prior, a lot of times these projects are well above mean high water, but we need that indicated on the plan so we know if we should get, you know, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of State involved, or and two, if we need to issue additional DEC permits for the work. Next slide. Okay, so this photo was taken in the town of Evans. And this is where a structure was at risk due to shoreline erosion, as well as actually flooding from wave runup. So in a situation like this, you would either need to move the structure landward away from the bluff's edge or install shoreline protection. If the lot depths are adequate, definitely moving the structure away from the eroding edge is the best solution, and it provides the best long-term resiliency. If the structure cannot be moved for landward for whatever reason, you know, due to the lot size or restrictions on the lot, then a shore protection structure would likely be required. Next slide, please. Okay, so this photo was taken in the town of Portland, and this is where there's an existing concrete wall in need of repair. As you can see, there's erosion occurring at the end section near the bottom of the photo, as well as the area along the top of the wall in front of the house. And this type of situation is really caused by erosion occurring along the footer or the bottom of the wall due to wave action. So when erosion along the bottom of the wall occurs, waves will then like move up and under the wall, causing large eroded areas on the land side of the wall. And if this were the case, you know, repairing the footer or filling in voids would likely be required. And then if the wall is frequently overtopped by waves, you could also look into installing, you know, new drainage, a splash pad, or creating maybe even an unmowed vegetative buffer with deep-rooted vegetation. And those options would really hold the land in place and, you know, drain the water when the waves come up on top of the wall. And then I should mention, you know, if damages are beyond repair and the entire wall needed to be replaced, alternatives that really replace the wall within the same footprint or eliminates additional lakeward encroachment should really be considered. If the existing wall can't be removed and a new wall needs to be installed, then like if the new wall was installed in front of it, we would require that the face of the new wall be placed no greater than 12 inches lakeward from the face of the existing wall. Next slide, please. So coordination with DEC, really before working on a project design, we always recommend that you contact DEC to determine what permits will be required, and also if the project itself is an acceptable solution. So oftentimes project designs need adjusting in order to meet our permit issuance standards. And in some cases, a proposed activity may even be prohibited on the shoreline. So definitely coordinating with us upfront will save time and cost in the long run. And that's our contact information.
Okay, I don't see any questions immediately in the chat box. So thank you, Dave and Beth, for that excellent presentation on DEC's side of the permitting. At this point, we're going to move on to our next speaker from the New York State Department of State. His name is Matthew Moraglio. Matt is a coastal resources specialist at the New York State Department of State and a supervisor in the Consistency Review Unit. He's been with the department since 2008 and has a range of responsibilities and interests, including shoreline management and coastal energy siting. Matt has previous experience with land surveying, stormwater management, and natural stream channel restoration. So with that, Matt, you can begin.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. All right, so today I'm going to go over the Federal Coastal Management Act and how the New York State Coastal Management Program fits into that act and various parts of the Coastal Management Program, including special management areas. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Federal Consistency Review, which is our regulatory program, and State and Local Consistency Review, which fit into New York's Coastal Management Program as regulatory tools for state and local entities. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So the Coastal Zone Management Act dates back to this guy, Richard Nixon, who signed it into law in 1972. This is the same era as Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, some of the most substantial environmental legislation in the U.S.'s history. And the Coastal Zone Management Act started out as an attempt to have a nationwide zoning law, and it didn't pan out as originally expected. So as a compromise position, Congress and the president decided to have a planning effort concentrated on where most of the people of the United States were living at that time, and that was near the coastline. Next slide, please. So as I said, it was passed in 1972, and what it did was it encouraged the coastal states to develop a coastal management program, which then provided a mechanism for planning to manage the coast. And it gave that responsibility to the states rather than to the federal government. It incentivized participation in two main ways. One, by providing funding for the coastal management programs in the various states to be developed and implemented. And it provided a certain amount of regulatory authority that was called Federal Consistency Review. And it's the nerdiest sounding regulatory program I can think of. But I've been doing it since 2008 and I always tuck my glasses in when I say it. At its heart, what it says is that certain federal actions cannot be undertaken without a state's consent. If you ever need to help yourself sleep at night, please go to 15 CFR Part 930 and read through that very informative section of the Code of Federal Regulations. Next slide, please. So we're going to focus on authoritative issues today, but know that there are various types of things the Federal Consistency Review applies to. So they can range from direct actions, such as the Army Corps of Engineers physically undertaking a dredging project, authoritative actions, such as permit issuance, which we're going to discuss today, funding actions, think of HUD, or Housing and Urban Development, giving money to a state or local government, and finally, outer continental shelf plans. Think offshore wind outside of New York State and the Atlantic Ocean. So know that the state of New York uses Federal Consistency Review as one means of implementing its plans for coastal management. It's not the only means. There are multiple other sets of state regulations and regulatory authorities that help implement this. Next slide, please. So over the 10-year period between 1972 and 1982, New York developed and adopted its coastal management program. New York made a decision to develop a networked coastal management program, whereby it took multiple sets of state laws and policies and regulations and combined them into one cohesive set of policies, which are to govern the way that coastal uses and resources are managed. This is in contrast to many other states which developed more centralized programs, whereby their Federal Consistency Review was held at their Department of Environmental Conservation or Department of Environmental Protection equivalent. New York instead elected to put it in their planning office, and that's at the Department of State. It also listed 44 coastal policies, and these can be thought of as buckets of state laws that describe the types of activities that can and cannot be done in New York's coastal area. In order to get its program approved, it required the passage of two important environmental laws, one being the Coastal Erosion Hazard Act, which Beth went into in some detail before, and Article 42 of the New York State Executive Law, which laid out the types of policies that the state was going to implement and provided a mechanism for the state to ensure that it was going to hold itself to the same standard as it holds the federal government to during its federal consistency reviews. What's also important is that the CMP incorporates special management areas. Now, I'm not going to say that these are unique to New York State, but they are kind of, they're more rare between all of the coastal states. New York's special management areas, these are areas that are provided some types of additional protections, broadly fit into these categories. LWRPs, which are local waterfront revitalization programs, significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats, colloquially we call them SIGHABs. My favorite, because of their names, SASs, or Scenic Areas of Statewide Significance, and the Long Island Sound Coastal Management Program, which is a regional coastal management program. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So local waterfront revitalization programs are local refinements of those 44 New York State coastal policies. They're developed at the municipal level, either usually by one municipality, but more than one municipality can join together to develop them jointly. Once they're completed with assistance from the Department of State, and that they are submitted to the federal government for incorporation into the Coastal Management Program. Once they're incorporated, the policies that are in that document are now binding on federal agencies and undertaking their actions. The Department of State, when conducting federal consistency review, uses the policies in that document to review actions that require federal permits and take the municipality's intent into consideration when regulating activities. Also, when a municipality develops a local waterfront revitalization program, they can currently develop a local consistency law for their own actions, either their own direct actions or their own authoritative actions. And this is the way that those local municipalities show us at the Department of State that they are going to hold themselves accountable to the same extent that we hold the federal government accountable to. Next slide, please. Significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats are areas that are designated by the Department of State upon recommendation by the Department of Environmental Conservation. They also incorporate comments from various federal resource agencies and apply to actions that occur within them and turn on a new coastal policy whenever an action is being undertaken there. So for instance, if somebody is proposing to place substantive amounts of fill in an area that's designated as a significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat, Policy 7 of the Coastal Management Program now applies, and the activity is viewed as to the damage that it could create in that significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat. This program takes a whole habitat look at the area and any impacts to it. It doesn't evaluate the impacts of an endangered species, although an endangered species can be one of the criteria to affect the designation of a significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat. Next slide, please. Briefly, I wanted to mention the scenic areas of statewide significance for the sake of completeness. They only exist in the Hudson River Valley and East Hampton, but conceivably they could be undertaken in Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. However, we don't have any intention at this time to create them. But they work similarly to significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats and provide additional protections for areas with identified scenic characteristics. Next slide, please. And again, for the sake of completeness, there is a regional coastal management program which works similarly to an LWRP. However, it's focused on Long Island Sound as a whole. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, the coastal area is everywhere that you see outlined in yellow here. And broadly speaking, that's anywhere the tide touches Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, Niagara and St. Lawrence rivers, and the connecting embayments. Now, in order for the Department of State to have a review of a federal action, the activity has to be within or affect this area that I've described here. If there's no federal activity being undertaken, then there's no federal consistency review. That's important when you start thinking about the types of jurisdiction that DEC may have with their Coastal Erosion Hazard Area Act, and where Beth and Dave were saying how a lot of activities occur above the plane of ordinary high water. In that case, there's likely not to be a federal permit, in which case the Department of State would have no authority to undertake a review. That yellow line there is roughly 1,000 feet inland from the water bodies that I've described, and they usually follow a road or a park boundary or some natural or political feature. It's not described anywhere in writing. It's a mapped boundary that can be found on our website, which I'll share later. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'll focus on federal consistency review of permitting actions today. Applicants for federal permit inside the New York State coastal area are required to be fully consistent with all 44 coastal policies, or a specific policy needs to be not applicable to that particular project. Fully consistent means that the activity has to comport with the policy fully, even if there's some law that prevents them from being fully consistent. If there was a law that prevents them from being fully consistent, then that activity would not be undertaken. We have a 6-month review period from receipt of a complete application. Know, however, that 6-month time period is also inclusive of the time it takes for us to gather any additional information to inform our review. So it actually goes fairly quickly. Next slide, please. If you were to apply to us for federal consistency review, what you are doing is certifying that you're going to conduct your activity in this manner that I've described before, fully consistent with all 44 coastal policies. Within 6 months, we will either concur with, conditionally concur with, or object to your consistency certification. If we do not respond to you within that 6-month time frame, our review is what's called conclusively presumed, which means that you can undertake the activity without our written concurrence. Next slide, please. So we have a few mechanisms to make that call. First off is the general concurrence. That's an abbreviated review process whereby we have listed several criterion that if are met, your project is automatically considered consistent and a general concurrence is issued. As I said, it's abbreviated and no public notice is required in that process. We also review the nationwide permit program that the Army Corps of Engineers utilizes on a 5-year basis. For each individual permit in the nationwide permit program, we make specific decisions regarding that permit. Many nationwide permits already have our blanket concurrence, meaning that if you are applying for one of those specific nationwide permits, our review is not required. Others require our review, and others require our review only in certain circumstances. As Dave mentioned before, the general permit, GP 0-20-004, has Department of State's concurrence. We worked very hard to design that permit in such a way that it reflected Department of State's concurrence with the various nationwide permit decisions that are out there. So again, to emphasize, if you do have authorization from DEC under that particular general permit, it doesn't require an individual DOS review except for very limited circumstances. The Army Corps of Engineers also has regional permits, which are general permits that are reviewed by us on a 5-year basis or whenever they are reauthorized by the Army Corps of Engineers for things like docks and minor dredging and things of that nature, which I'll leave to Army Corps to describe if they'd like to. For, the details of Department of State's concurrence are written into each one of those regional permits individually. Next slide, please. If you do not meet either of those 3 conditions before, either a nationwide permit, a regional permit, or general concurrence, the Department of State would then be undertaking what we term a full review. So this is where we'd be soliciting any additional information that we need, and reviewing every policy to determine whether or not your project was consistent with that policy or it was not applicable. It's required for us to undertake a public notice period and consider any comments that are returned. We can do what's called a conditional concurrence, whereby we condition our concurrence on one or more special conditions that, if are not met, automatically turns from a concurrence into an objection. An objection follows a similar path, where we undertake a public notice and we provide the applicant with a letter that states which policies they are inconsistent with. Once an objection is issued, the federal agency, in most cases the Army Corps, for the types of projects we're discussing here, is permitted to issue the permit. Next slide, please. For us to undertake a review and for that 6-month time clock to start, we require a complete application. Many of the materials that Beth described earlier are part of a complete application for the Department of State. One additional piece that's necessary is a completed FCAF, or Federal Consistency Assessment form. And that's the form where you are making your certification to us. Next slide, please. And here's an example of a piece of the Federal Consistency Assessment form. This presents a number of yes or no questions. If you were to answer yes to any of these questions, the question identifies, in parentheses, the coastal policy number that is potentially applicable. And for every question that you answer yes to, you would go to the Coastal Management Program, find that particular policy, and write a narrative statement describing how your action is going to be consistent with that policy. Next slide, please. And lastly on that form is the certification. This is very important to provide to us and make sure that it's adequately executed and signed, because this is what we are reacting to. We don't issue you a permit. We agree with or disagree with this statement that you were making, this certification. Next slide, please. So I've spoken a lot about policies, and as I said before, you can best think of them as buckets for various state laws to fit into, but broadly they fit into these categories. And I could spend an entire morning discussing every single policy here, likely more than that. So we'll leave that for another training. Next slide, please. I like to think that I'm always right, but as I'm often reminded, I am not. So there is an appeal mechanism for federal consistency decisions. It's afforded only to the applicant, meaning that an adjacent neighbor would not be trying to appeal our decision. And the appeal mechanism sits in the U.S. Secretary of with the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. So for the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to override the Department of State's decision, they have to find that three criterion are met: that the activity significantly and substantially furthers the national interest, that those interests outweigh the adverse coastal effects, and that there are no reasonable alternatives. That last piece there, no reasonable alternatives, is a very difficult standard to reach, because in many situations there are reasonable alternatives that can be undertaken to serve the goals of the project. Next slide, please. And I mentioned briefly local consistency law before. This is an example of the town of Wheatfield, Chapter 200, whereby they created a process where their own internal decisions have to follow their local waterfront revitalization program, and provided a structure and a format to do that. Next slide, please. I discussed briefly before local waterfront revitalization programs. Each local waterfront program is on our website. If you've been through this training before, please note the new web address here. We've made some recent updates, but each local waterfront revitalization program on this list lists appropriate contact information and the applicable coastal policies. If you do visit this website, please make sure to scroll all the way down to the bottom for a listing of the LWRPs. Next slide. We also maintain a geographic information gateway, which provides geographic data for all the special management areas that I discussed before, as well as a litany of other pertinent data. So please feel free to browse that. And next slide, please. And again, updated information on this page here, recently updated given our new website update. And with that, my contact information is on the next slide, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt, for that background on the Department of State's role in the permitting process. Our next speaker and final speaker, but certainly not last, is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it is Shana Souter. Shana Souter is a regulatory biologist of 12 years with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Buffalo District Regulatory Branch. She primarily works in the monitoring enforcement section and has experience in New York and Ohio permitting, also with a wide variety of waters and projects. Shana plays a large role in outreach for the regulatory branch and has elaborated on this experience by serving a year in the Corps of Engineers Buffalo District Public Affairs Office. Prior to starting with the Corps of Engineers, she earned a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Forest Biology from SUNY ESF in May 2009. With that, go right ahead, Shana.
Okay, so hello everybody. I'm Shana Souter from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as Roy just introduced me. Today I'm going to go over our regulatory program. We're a little different than the rest of the Corps because we don't do the projects that the Corps is, usually implementing and putting in the ground on our waterways. But we are looking at your permits, and we are a permitting program, and we're trying to find that balance between the public need for development or stabilization in a lot of the cases along the shoreline, and also protecting those aquatic resources. So if you could please go to the next slide. We have two authorities that our regulatory branch operates under. The first is Section 10 of the River and Harbors Act of 1899. This applies to all navigable waterways, and essentially all work in, over, or under these waterways are considered something that needs permits. So these waters are regulated because if you were doing work in, over, or under it, then a permit's going to be required for those activities. The limits of jurisdiction on navigable waterways are, they cease at the ordinary high water mark, which and it can extend to adjacent wetlands too. For Lake Erie, the ordinary high water mark that we use is 573.4 feet, International Great Lakes Datum 1985. And I think it's the same for DC, even though they call it the mean high water mark. So if you have wetlands adjacent to Lake Erie that are at that elevation or lower, and they come right up to Lake Erie, that would be considered a Section 10 wetland, and any work in that wetland would also need a Section 10 permit. Okay, next slide, please. Our second authority is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and this will extend inland a little bit more because it applies to a lot more waters than just navigable waterways. It can apply to navigable waterways. It can apply to inland lakes and ponds that flow outward, tributaries, rivers, lakes, streams, creeks, and any adjacent wetlands to these waterways. So there's the definition of the water of the United States has been changing rapidly in the last 5 years, and it has gone back and forth a little bit. Currently, we're operating under Rapano, so almost anything that you can find a flow path to is considered, flow path to a navigable waterway is considered a water of the United States. And any water of the United States that has a project proposed that is going to result in a discharge of dredged or fill material into it is regulated, meaning you would need a permit. Fill material, I don't think there's actual formal definition in the regulations, but it can be anything that's changing the bottom elevation of that waterway, changing how that waterway operates. Dredged material, rock, sand, dirt, broken concrete, mulch sometimes can be considered fill, but it would have to be like a large amount of it. So that's what fill material is. Once again, in streams, rivers, lakes, the limits of jurisdiction ceases at the ordinary high water mark, which is not always an elevation. Some waterways like the Finger Lakes and the Great Lakes have an established elevation for that, and maybe even the Erie Canal. But sometimes you have to look for other indications, such as like where the vegetation ceases along the shore or watermarks. Those types of things help you find the ordinary high water mark. And then for wetlands, we regulate up to the wetland boundary where the upland would start. Unlike DEC, we don't regulate buffers. We don't have a buffer area. So once that wetland boundary is established, that's where we would have jurisdiction to. And if you were going to place fill material into a wetland or a waterway, you would need a permit from our office under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Next slide, please. So any activities or structures requiring here's an example of some activities or structures requiring permits in navigable waterways. A lot of the ones that are listed here are the ones around this area. So Lake Erie, St. Lawrence River is on there, Niagara River, Tonawanda Creek, Erie Canal, Buffalo River, Cayuga Creek, Cattaraugus Creek. As you can see, is navigable from the mouth to Penn Central Bridge, about 3/4 miles upstream from the mouth in Lake Erie. Dunkirk Harbor's Section 10, Skajakawitta Creek. So if you were proposing any decks, boathouses, those would be Section 10 permits you would need from our office. If you were proposing riprap stone revetments, bioengineered protective structures, breakwalls, jetties, seawalls, which all probably result in fill, not just work in, over, or under, you would need a Section 10 and a Section 404 permit, which we would evaluate from our office, but those are the authorities that the permit would be coming from for your information. And I did put the link down there that takes you to a document on our website that lists the Section 10 navigable waterways in our area for New York. So if you want to check that out, that's on our website. Next slide, please. Permits. So we have a lot of different permits available from the regulatory branch. The most common on the Lake Erie shoreline would be Nationwide Permit 3, 13, or 19. These three are nested with that DEC General Permit 0-20-004, as previously discussed from DEC and Department of State. Other nationwide permits may also be used separate from the DEC general permit, but as indicated prior, you'd have to submit that joint application form to our office and possibly DEC too if it didn't apply under that GP. So you can apply for that GP with DEC, and in certain instances, you will not need to contact us if you are affirmed for use under that. There are some instances, what I'll talk about more. Nationwide permit number 3 is for maintenance activities mainly. So if you have a current serviceable structure that you're trying to repair or rehabilitate, just to make it serviceable, again, something that's useful, Nationwide permit 3 is the permit that we would go to cover that. Nationwide permit number 13 is for bank stabilization projects, and a wide variety of things can be covered under that. I think a lot of people most instantly think that it's going to be riprap, but sometimes natural shore work using vegetation and bioengineering can be covered under that. And that permit will cover any work that goes up to 500 linear feet along the shoreline and the work should be no more than 1 cubic yard of material discharged below the ordinary high water mark per running foot of the bank being stabilized. So what that means, if you're doing 500 feet, 1 cubic yard per foot. And then Nationwide Permit 13 does not allow any work in wetlands. Nationwide Permit number 19 is for dredging, minor dredging, no more than 25 cubic yards of material, no work in wetlands, and more importantly, the material dredged under that permit cannot go into another water of the United States. The disposal location has to be an upland or dry land. So our nationwide permits, there's a lot more than that, but those are the 3 that you would use most commonly. I think there's like 57 or 58. They're issued every 5 years across the nation, and we're up for new ones shortly. Some were issued last year under the previous administration, but another round of them is supposed to happen this year. And so if you were proposing other work in waters of the United States different from this, you might be covered in one of those general permits as well. Next slide, please. All right, back to the DEC General Permit 0-020-004. This permit is wonderful. As Dink said previously, our permits number 3, 13, and 19 are nested right in there with this permit. So if you get affirmation from DEC saying you're good to go under this permit, you almost always, unless you're in one of these certain instances that are labeled on the slide, you don't need to contact us. Certain instances that where you are usually related to endangered species being located in a specific town, which I don't think there are anything on the Lake Erie shoreline. I think it's more up along the Lake Ontario shoreline. And also if you are proposing more than 1 cubic yard per running foot along the shoreline is when you would need to contact our office to be able to work under one of these permits and use that GP from DEC. So, I mean, that's really important, and that saves us a lot of time and effort, and you a lot of time and effort, and hopefully gets you going on your project sooner to stabilize your banks. Next slide, please. Other permits that we have, standard permits and letters of permission. These are considered individual permits from our office. These are for larger scale projects that would not fit one of our normal general permits, nationwide permits. I forgot to mention that in New York, we also have regional general permits, probably 2 of which that you might occasionally see along the shoreline. One is Regional General Permit 87-00-1, which is for a certain size dock or boathouses or temporary docks. And then Regional General Permit 81-00-1 is for dredging, certain dredging work. So those are other general permits that I forgot to mention that you could apply for, but are not related to that DEC general permit at all. So going back to these permits on this slide, the standard permits are those are the highest level permit you could seek. So if you have a large scale project that's resulting in a lot of fill into a waterway, navigable or water of the United States, or it's just an overall, like imagine a very large utility line project that has a lot of impacts, you would be going through a standard permit process. These are usually quite lengthy and they take up to 120 days from the time of a complete application, but can go a lot longer than that if we cannot get the information and agreement to be compliant with the National Environmental Policy Act. So a public notice goes out once we have enough information to know what the project is about. And that is for all people to comment on. And those are usually posted on our website. And I think they are mailed to a certain number of property owners adjacent and other agencies. And then an evaluation of alternatives needs to be done, which we're looking to see if there's the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. Basically, what's the least harmful to the environment but accomplishes the project purpose? And are there other feasible opportunities to be considered here? Are there other things that could be done to still get what the property owner needs or the company needs, but still minimize those impacts to the environment? So that's the general gist of a standard permit. A letter of permission is a little smaller scale of a standard permit. It's for slightly larger impacts from the general permits up, but it also could cover like a dock that's larger than 1,200 square feet or up to an acre of fill into a wetland. This is also, again, you're going to use that joint application form in New York for both of these. In the letter of permission, instead of a public notice, there is a 15-day comment period for agencies. We send coordination letters explaining the project to specific agencies such as the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. EPA, New York State Department of State, New York State DEC. I almost said Ohio EPA because I also work in Ohio. So, and those are some of the agencies we coordinate with. And then it also goes to adjacent property owners and they have 15 days to provide comments. And then once we get those back, the applicant needs to respond to those and see if there's any changes that would result better environmental, to reduce environmental impacts on from the project. So for both IPs and EPs, DEC permits, water quality certification is section 401 of the water, I'm sorry, hold on a second. Water quality certification is under section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And New York State DEC holds that in New York State because the state holds section 401. So if you are getting an individual permit or very limited circumstances do we issue emergency permits. You would need an individual water quality certification and an individual Department of State coastal consistency, federal consistency under the Coastal Zone Management Act concurrence in order for our permits to be valid. We cannot issue these permits until we have those. So that's something else to consider if you're seeking one of these larger scale permits. So that joint application form also can be found on our website, which I will post in the chat after my presentation. Next slide, please. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background. Consideration on permitting activities and structures. So we recognize that there's a right of the landowner to protect their property from erosion. We want you to be able to stabilize your bank, but we also want to do it in a way to balance that public need of the environment being practically safe. So we do a public interest review, consideration of those balancing factors. What's the need for the project? Are there any navigational impacts? And I mentioned sometimes we have to coordinate with the U.S. Coast Guard. And some of our permits actually have conditions built into them that say certain things like you have to have the right safety lights on your structures and stuff like that. If you're going to be building something like a groin out into the waterway to protect and stabilize your property, is that going to cause navigational issues for the waterway and cause safety hazards? Are there any impacts to the up and down drift property owners adjacent to you or even further down the way? Because sometimes when we harden the shoreline, it could cause additional erosion on those people who do not have hardened shorelines. That's something I've seen a lot in my career here at the Corps, especially out on Lake Erie in Ohio. I haven't seen it a whole lot in Lake Erie in New York, but I work boundary enforcement, and I've seen a lot of that happening where people we've seen a lot of instances where people have put in groins and it's resulted in erosion on their own property or the ones downdrift, and we were successful in having them remove them to reduce that. The effect on aquatic resource, is your project going to cause any environmental harm to the resource, causing issues to water quality? Is it going to change how the lake functions or the other waterway functions? In Lake Erie specifically, we have a very unique littoral system, or a very nice littoral system. The lake's a little shallower, so the drift is very sensitive, and we've seen a lot of changes to the sand budget over time, which I think Roy was talking about a little bit earlier. Also, I think it was mentioned earlier when Beth was speaking, the effectiveness of the protective feature. A lot of times when we see project proposed, we're considering whether they are something that is going to last long term. I think 30 years is, especially on the Great Lakes, 30 years is what we're looking to see if the structure is going to last at least 30 years with minimal maintenance. Next slide, please. All right, so the Corps of Engineers regulatory program, we are responsible for a lot of compliance with other statutes. The legislators have put this into our rules, and our permits are very contingent on making sure we coordinate for these other statutes that have been put out by the legislators. Sorry, my mouth's really dry. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, which I talked about previously, is typically held by the state. It's for water quality certification. New York State Department of Environmental Conservation holds that, and we work closely with them on that. Some of our general permits, the nationwide permits, already have blanketed water quality certification in them. And if you meet the terms and conditions that were put in there for water quality certification on those nationwide permits, then you do not need to seek it separately from New York State DEC. It's already blanketed on that nationwide permit. Same thing for coastal zone management program. We need a federal coastal consistency statement in order for any coastal projects to occur. And New York State Department of State holds that in New York. And once again, sometimes that's blanketed into our nationwide permits. And if you're meeting the terms and conditions of that, then you do not need to seek that separately. Same thing for both of those, as we stated previously, that GP 020-004 is great for that. Furthermore, Endangered Species Act, Section 7 coordination. We are responsible for making sure if there's any threat to endangered species or threatened species that are federally listed, we need to coordinate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for your project. If there's going to be no effect and we can determine that, we can make that effect and we do not need to coordinate with them. But if there's a may effect, then we do need to reach out to them, and there might be some additional coordination to occur with them. Another one, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Any historic properties or cultural resources in your area would need to be coordinated if there is any potential effects to them. An example of that would be, say you live in a house that's listed as a historical structure with the National Historic Preservation Act, and you are building a new armor stone revetment on your shoreline. The aesthetic view of that could alter, it could be considered an impact on that historical structure. So we would need to coordinate that with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Other coordination that we need to do, I talked a little bit about National Environmental Policy Act earlier, because we have to do the policy review, or we have to do the public interest review and the alternatives analysis, which is important to make sure that we're reaching that least environmental damaging practicable alternative. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and the U.S. Coast Guard. One thing I also would like to note is along the shoreline, as I indicated previously, our jurisdiction goes up to the ordinary high water mark. If you're working up above that on your shoreline and your work's not going over that elevation, say your dock's extending out over the waterway, that would be what I mean over, then you would not need a permit from the Corps. Only if work's in, over, under, or there's a discharge of fill below 573.4 feet in Lake Erie. Next slide, please. Oh, and I guess we're at the end. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And I will put the link to our contact page in the message box along with my signature also.
Okay, thank you, Shayna. That concludes I'm gonna stop my share right here so we can all look at each other. That concludes the presentations for today. We do have some time for a question and answer session right now. We could probably go to about 3 o'clock, a little bit after that. But if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box right now, and we will make sure they get answered. And if the speakers want to re-put, well, Shayna already did it. I think Dave and Beth also put their contact information in there. A few of the things that I'm going to keep from this, aside from the recording, we'll also keep the chat transcript, so you'll be able to see that afterwards and see some of the Q&A there. So do we have any questions?
Roy, I did have one question come in, and just to clarify for the group, are you going to be following up with some of these resources that were included in the presentations in an email following the workshop?
Yes, I will be, and we're also going to try to couple that with a workshop evaluation as well. Usually we would just hand those out and let you fill them out the day of, but we can't do that right now. Just for a little background, this is the second time we've done a virtual version of this. The first time was Tuesday. In the future, we do want to do more of these in person so that you can interact more closely with the speakers and ask questions that way. But for right now, we're doing the best we can. So yeah, we will follow up. We'll give you a chance to evaluate the workshop so we can share that with the speakers and improve these in the future. But if we have some questions, we'd like to see them right now. So I'm not seeing any come in. We are at 2:50, so I'll give it a couple more minutes. But just want to reiterate that if you want to come back and look at this later, we are going to post this in the website probably in January when some of our staff gets back that handles the website portion of New York Sea Grant. But if you are interested in going forward with this and do you want to talk to some of the experts today, do not be afraid to reach out. There's a reason I have these people come and do these workshops, because they are very personal. They are good speakers, and they're, you know, they're straight shooters. They're gonna tell you what's up. So actually, I just saw a few things pop up in the chat. So Mike Morgante has a question. Is a DEC permit required if work behind an existing beach wall is intended to strengthen that structure?
I can take that one. So if the wall is located in a coastal erosion hazard area, repair behind the wall would likely require a coastal erosion hazard area permit. So any excavating, placement of fill or alteration of that wall would be considered a regulated activity. So you would need a permit. That activity would be covered underneath the general permit. So it would be a simplified process, but we would still need project plans and an application submitted for that work.
Thank you, Beth. Okay, well, you all do have the contact information for the speakers today, including myself, Beth, Dave, Matt, and Shayna. So if you want to reach out to us, please do so. We are all open to work with you through this process. If nothing else rolls in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to stop the recording. And thank you to everybody that took time out of your afternoon to be a part of this. I think this is a very good session. I think we had 41 people up at one point, so that's about the same as we had Tuesday. We couldn't beat them, but that's okay. We'll try to beat them in person in the next time we try this. So thanks for coming. Thank you to our speakers. And also I want to say thanks to Megan Coker, who helped out with the chat today and making sure people were muted when there was some background noise and everything else. So with that, I'm going to stop recording, and thank you all so much for being a part of this. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.